We now have the receipts that Justin Trudeau's government used lies and misinformation to help justify the use of the Emergencies Act during the trucker convoy. The explosive exposé Hategate was released last week. One of the investigative journalists who authored this exposé, Caryma Sa'd, joins me tonight. Caryma has also covered other protest movements in Canada, so we will be definitely covering the 1 Million March for Children protest against gender ideology in schools and how the Canadian Anti-Hate Network may be connected to that as well. The conversation starts now.
I promise you, I will not let you down.
The trucks parked outside illegally should move.
Canada's Conservatives will meet our Paris climate commitment.
Enough with the woke. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I take that back.
To champion our conservative principles.
We are the party of law and order.
To call in the auditors.
We haven't yet decided whether we're going to call for the government to impose a mandatory test or vaccination.
And we will win the next election. Canada must not ignore the reality of climate change.
Why weren't Canadians vaccinated in January and February like everyone else?
Welcome, everybody, to Controlled Opposition, episode number 28. Tonight is a very special episode. We have a lawyer from Toronto, someone who has frequented many protests in Canada, and she is now an investigative journalist and author of #Hategate, the one and only Caryma Sa'd. How are you this evening?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. We're obviously going to talk about the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, how that connects to Hategate, how that connects to the 1 Million March for Children that we've seen this week. A lot going on in the country. But to start, let's start on some common ground, because we are both a little bit provocateurs. We're people who criticize our own side. If I'm not mistaken, you are more left-leaning, correct? Is that how you characterize yourself if we had to use that paradigm?
It's how people, well, actually, it's a fair characterization, I suppose. I think it's kind of a fake binary, but right. For the purposes of this conversation, sure.
Generically, yeah. I mean, it is sort of a fake binary, but what we're about to talk about are kind of make it real in a sense, because, you know, starting Controlled Opposition and criticizing the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre, a lot of people are upset at me. They're like, Greg, you know, we got to get Trudeau out. Don't criticize Pierre Poilievre. And it's been pretty bad. But I imagine it might be worse for you, because you're someone who has criticized people on your side, or you've kind of given sympathy to Jeremy Mackenzie. Oh, my goodness. What has that experience been like for you? And please be very upfront about it, because I can imagine it's been like abuse might be a term that might potentially come up. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it has been a journey. And in fact, it kind of started not with me sympathizing or anything along those lines, but I simply tried to have a comedy show featuring Chris Sky. And that was like a turning point, because up to then, I had been covering rallies. I think that, you know, I was there as an observer. I had some of my own commentary to share, and it was widely supported by people on the left and the far left as well. And when I tried to interview Chris Sky, suddenly that was a bridge too far, and it's been very challenging ever since, because I get portrayed falsely as a white supremacist, as a Nazi, as a, you know, all manner of smears that just don't apply. And it's difficult confronting groupthink on either end of the spectrum, but particularly on the left, there is almost a need to be in perfect lockstep with one another at every given moment. And the second that you are pushing back against or questioning or challenging a narrative, that can result in being at the center of like a total shitstorm. And so that's been my experience. And yeah, abuse, it's not an unfair term to use. At one point I had to move because of harassment. It's been online, it's been in person, it's been through frivolous complaints to the Law Society against me, to a former employer, to the city, to Elections Ontario, any sort of entity perceived to have authority over me has received complaints, as far as I can tell, and they're baseless. So yeah, it is a journey, and kind of, there's value in being able to critique and for people to receive critique if it's delivered in good faith. And that's what I try to do. And I haven't had that same courtesy in return.
Yeah. You touched on a lot of things that are kind of a theme tonight, I think. First of all, ding, Chris Sky, he was featured on Anti-Hate. And the characterization that Anti-Hate makes of people is very reflective, I would argue, of a lot of how the left wing operates, which is, it's not like you got that a little bit wrong, or I kind of disagree with you a bit. It's, you are Hitler, like you are literally the worst. You are dancing with the devil, like, and then you actually get tattled on and reported to, basically institutions, as you were listing, like people, they try to, in a way, like, this might sound like rhetoric, but they kind of try to ruin your life. Like they kind of try to like isolate you and cut you off and just give you like such horrible consequences for, you didn't really even have the wrong opinion, unless your opinion was, hey, I want to have a conversation with this individual about COVID going on, which really sucks, by the way, that event got canceled with Chris Scott, because that would have been really great content.
I would have roasted the shit out of him. So yeah, everyone missed out. Big time.
Really?
For sure.
Well, I mean, Chris Guy's pretty good on his feet. I don't know.
He's not, but that's okay. We're not here to talk about Chris Guy. I know that you supported his mayoral candidacy. That is, in a democracy, absolutely, you're right to be wrong. I'm okay with that. But no, in all seriousness,
are you happy with Olivia Chow right now? We don't have to get into that, but
no. To your point, though, hyperbole in political discourse, it, among other things, it degrades the meaning of words, and I think that is such a problem. As a lawyer, we communicate with words, and in fact, words have serious meanings and implication. A comma in the wrong place can entirely change the significance of a sentence, right? So when words like Nazi or, comparisons to Hitler or what have you are thrown around so easily, it makes it so we are less able to communicate with one another.
Yeah, less able to communicate one another, less incentivized to actually share what's on our mind, at risk of being vilified or being ostracized. And I think another big one, especially in the right wing, is associating, even asking the wrong question, or even being seen with the wrong people, or liking the wrong tweet for Pete's sake. It's quite intense. But I think you're right. Where is the discourse these days? Where's the debate these days? Something that I bring up a lot is, or I haven't brought up in a while, in the 2021 election, there was not even a debate on vaccine mandates, which, at the time, Aaron O'Toole ran the Conservative Party. But to me, that seems like a real sort of failure of, what everyone was going through at the time. I'm unvaccinated, so maybe I'm biased, but as we saw the trucker convoy, that kind of showed a sort of well, that was hey, there wasn't a debate about this topic, and now there's a whole bunch of trucks from across the country in Ottawa. I feel like those two things are kind of connected, in my opinion. Anyway, I'm not sure if you agree, but
I would echo that it's harder to talk to one another. You mentioned the consequences of feeling that you're less incentivized to speak your mind. That stifles progressive thought, because the way that we evolve as a society is by exchanging ideas, improving upon each other's ideas, kind of learning from each other. And where that can't happen because we're afraid of wrongthink, essentially, that it's regressive. It's the opposite of what the left should stand for, and it's not beneficial to anyone. So whoever is engaging in that behavior, cut it out.
Yeah. So we're going to get into Hategate, and a lot of my audience probably knows the gist of Hategate, but I kind of want to hear your experience of kind of slowly seeing how deep this rabbit hole goes. And, I summarize Hategate as something as what I thought I knew already, which was I feel like, Diagolon is a meme country, and this regime used these memes and veterans who own guns. They whipped up a bunch of misinformation, and they used that to justify the use of the Emergencies Act. That was kind of my perception of it. But I know that you need to be very diplomatic in that explanation. But you also include how Jeremy works into this as well, because did you think that Jeremy was this legit boogeyman at the time? He has all these firearms charges, and you're kind of learning about what actually has happened to him. But tell me what your experience was like of kind of, I don't know if you've lost faith in these institutions. I sure have. But, how has your perspective changed on this journey?
So I'll start kind of with Hategate. Elisa Hadigan and I were given access to Freedom of Information documents, over 1,000 pages, primarily emails and reports involving the RCMP. And from that, we were able to discern some patterns and some concerns about the ways that they investigated and information shared about Diagolon and Jeremy Mackenzie. And the conclusion that we drew from it, the Emergencies Act, the invocation of that, there were a lot of variables, a lot of moving parts. But if we think back to the frenzy of February 2022, I think Diagolon was a significant part of that. We had MPs and senators speaking about this existential threat to Canada, this militia that wants to establish a white ethno-state, this weapons cache where there's connections to this group. And so it was all very alarming. And I think that people consuming that information were right to be concerned if they took it at face value. But the problem was, and this is what Elisa and I kind of concluded in reviewing these Freedom of Information documents, there was a feedback loop between law enforcement, media, and government officials, where they were all repeating back to one another the same information, copy-pasted, almost as though they expected each other to do the heavy lifting of investigation, and they were just reporting back. And a lot of this misinformation or misleading information came from one source, that being the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. So we have anti-hate at kind of the nexus of this broken telephone game between RCMP, cabinet ministers, and media. And, to answer your question, how did I initially, or what was my connection to Jeremy? we didn't, like, we first connected in April of 2022. And at the time, the only information I had to go on was what was being said in the media. And so I was fairly apprehensive about that conversation. I didn't know fully what I was walking into. But the reason for speaking is I had put out a thread describing my experiences with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and an open invite to anyone else who had similar or different types of experiences so we could connect and better understand what was happening. And Jeremy is someone who responded to that. I'm not sure he actually expected me to take him up on the offer to speak, but we did. And I listened. And that was kind of the end of it. We went our separate ways at that point, but I kept an eye on him, on the situation from afar, just watching how media was reporting, how, you know, this narrative was constructed around him, a variety of legal problems, and sort of that's the origin story there. And you know, when he got arrested and hauled from Halifax or Nova Scotia to Saskatchewan, something prompted me to go watch the bail hearing. And I'm very glad that I did, because it provided me even more insight into the situation. And, you know, from there, I was able to, my perspective at that point had shifted from this is someone I need to be afraid of to this is someone who is receiving a lot of heat from the state, and I want to better understand why and how, and, you know, what's going on. There's a publication ban attached to the bail hearing, so I can't be specific about what prompted this light bulb. But from there, I've taken a real interest in watching these legal proceedings unfold.
And I thank you for that. I thank you for that. That, you know, whether it was your principles or your values or just your sort of intuition to be like, maybe this guy isn't a boogeyman. Maybe there's more to the story. But I was thinking as you were kind of sharing that, you've covered this story. You've covered Hategate. In my opinion, I know you like to be diplomatic and not too opinionated, Caryma, but in my opinion, this seems like a really big deal in terms of the failure of the news media, failure of major institutions, and to an extent the RCMP and police. Why do you think no major news outlets have picked this up?
I think the simplest and most likely explanation is that, well, there's two. One is there's already been a lot of investment into a particular narrative, and that narrative includes the Canadian Anti-Hate Network as an expert, as a trusted source, and to walk that back is a big move, right? And so I think that that's part of it. And there's also a degree of whether it is embarrassment or, you know, egg on your face or what have you. I think that that's sort of another part of the equation. And there's actually a whole chapter in Hategate that's dedicated to cowardice and how in Canadian society, it's a real problem. It's a real problem because we enjoy being comfortable. That makes us complacent, and sticking one's neck out, given the precariousness of the media industry, for example, and how nepotistic it can be, the cronyism that exists, there's not a lot of push for uncomfortable truths. But fundamentally, that's what journalism is. Journalism is expressing uncomfortable truths, and that's what Elisa and I are trying to do here.
Yes, absolutely. There is a link to Hategate down below for those who have not yet read it. But yeah, I did want to highlight as well a particular part of the story, which I commemorate you for, which is I think you really tell part of Jeremy's story very, very well. One in which I don't think I've ever read before. Specifically, you talk about his podcast right here. There is a method to the madness. An individual episode is meant to be taken in its entirety. Each performance consists of roughly 3 parts and is meant to end on a positive note. Despite tackling heated or bleak subjects in a high-intensity stream of consciousness format, Jeremy strives to portray hopeful messaging. He is keenly aware of high suicide rates among veterans and wants his viewers to leave entertained and reassured. The softness of this approach is sometimes camouflaged by the bluntness of military culture. It gives me chills just reading it, because it's that is something that what's the word? Context. That's the context that is grossly missing from all of the mischaracterizations of Jeremy and the little quotes that are taken out of context. And I think it's important to point out, though, that the only reason that you've had to, make this very eloquent description of the context of what Jeremy does is after he's been dragged after jail, after he's been kind of characterized as a boogeyman, like all after the fact, because really no one would have needed to make that description of what he does. What he does just would have been. But the only reason that you had to kind of clarify all that is because he's been turned into this, quite frankly, awful boogeyman. I even have a story of a friend of my parents who asked, "Oh, have you heard of Diagolon?" And they were like, "I'm pretty sure that's a joke." And they're like, "No, that's what they all say. That's what they all say." And it's like something I've noticed in politics is the information or the message, whether it's true or not, whatever message is sent out by the news media, it has a snowball effect. It gets exaggerated through gossip and all that type of thing. And a good example maybe would be, well, I kind of like to use the PPC as an example, because they say, oh, they have like anti-immigration views. And then that manifests, and I know this because I ran for the PPC in 2019, that manifest says, you're a Nazi, like you are the worst person. Oh my God, like you criticized immigration. You are the worst boss. You're Hitler. So it is quite alarming. But I don't know if you want to say anything.
I've talked about these concepts before, but there's primacy bias and confirmation bias, and the two feed into each other. And so the first time you hear about something, that is going to subconsciously create a framing, and new information that you subsequently take in, you try to make it match that framing, because we don't like cognitive dissonance, right? We like things to make sense. And so if the first thing someone heard about Jeremy Mackenzie, which it likely was, came from a news source portraying him in a certain way, then that makes it a lot easier to take in snippets or cherry-picked moments and sort of fit it into a narrative. And frankly, Jeremy makes that easy sometimes for them to do. So that's an issue. And to then change your mind about something, that's asking a lot for people. People do not like changing their minds. And if they do, they want to have an opportunity to do it gently and save face. So that's sort of what you're up against as far as public opinion and shifting that. And we make this point in the report, but if someone was a fly on the wall in a room where people were talking about Risk or Dungeons and Dragons, and they
like Risk the board game.
Yeah, Risk the board game, right? Or Settlers of Catan or whatever.
Sure.
And they're talking about coups and takeovers, and we're going to destroy their crops and like whatever else. I don't play any of those things, but I understand enough from popular culture to know that it's like a political game, right? But if you took that at face value, it would be very concerning. And the elements of military culture, gun culture that makes people uncomfortable if they are unfamiliar with it, because it is perceived as scary. And so it's a lot easier to spin a nefarious tale. And the fact is that, you know, the Hategate affair, it's not about endorsing Jeremy's content or, you know, Diagolon, or it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant to everything, whether he is offensive or distasteful or asshole-ish or what. It doesn't matter, because the threshold for the RCMP is criminality, right? And if there is no criminality, then what are we doing here? Why is information being passed up the chain of command to Five Eyes partners? Like, it doesn't make sense. And the reason or explanation for that, you know, we go back to complacency and cowardice and copy and paste work that it isn't solid. You know, so that's, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of my take on why it was necessary to put in that description, because we're, you know, people have a perception that is deeply ingrained as a result of a year of bad press.
Yeah. And quickly back to this kind of this important context that you give of Jeremy's story. I would make the argument that you could make the same sort of context for someone who is an anti-vaxxer, or specifically someone who opposed vaccine mandates back during the pandemic, because the media really didn't do these people any favors. They, you know, there's the infamous Toronto Star headline that says, "I don't care if these people die," or something to that effect, which was very alarming. There's also, you know, political cartoons that are kind of like, you know, a visualization of flicking away anyone who dares kind of stand up for the unvaccinated. And there, you could have the same context of like, well, these people are concerned about bodily autonomy and they have their plenty of reasons. And I think especially since the convoy with the mandates hopefully going away and staying away, that I believe these people have been vindicated. But at the time, there really was a lot of pressure upon unvaccinated people, or even people who opposed mandates. And speaking of changing minds, Caryma, have you changed your mind at all over how you covered some of this stuff back then? Because I can bring up a couple cartoons of that you've done in the past. I'll bring up this one to start, which is from, I believe, 2021 July, where you're depicting Doug Ford. Ontario is open for business, but this is really just the donor saying this, like with the hand here, and this is the education minister, I believe. Your kids will be fine, probably. And my interpretation of this is it's these horrible conservatives who are daring to open up the province again, as if it's like the worst, not the worst. I think that's my interpretation of what the message that is meant in this cartoon. And for me, you know, I obviously completely disagree with it back then, but I disagree with it now. But, you know, this kind of like vilification of anyone who would open up aspects of, you know, to reverse lockdowns. Do you still feel that way about like the pandemic and everything that went down, or do you stand by that still, or kind of what are your politics reflecting on that, knowing that how misinformation operates now in the country?
I think the interpretation I would give to that comic, if you pull it back up.
Sure.
So I forget when this came out. I guess it's sometime in...
This is July 22 here. I'm pretty sure it's 2021, yeah.
No, I think it would have been 2021. Yeah. So two things. One is this notion of donors and lobbyists pulling strings. I still hold that. I think that that's an accurate reflection of the Ford government. And it's contentious because our whole notion of what is science-based, I think, is hard to parse through due to political interference. So I am not a scientist and I don't purport to be one. However, the point here is donors and lobbyists at no point should be controlling government, right? And Ontario's open for business, like you're probably aware, that's our provincial motto, right? It's changed from yours to discover. So that's Ford. Sure. And then Leachy, and the impetus behind this particular comic was an article about the different level of protection and resources that were afforded to private schools versus public schools. So, the comic, that's kind of, I don't know that there's much I would change on that. It wasn't an endorsement of lockdowns, although if I recall correctly at that time, there were concerns about the manner in which Ford was opening up, and that's been consistent throughout because he's been inconsistent throughout. And there's been criticism regardless of what move he's making. It just seems that he is unprincipled in his approach. And the education minister for his part, I think does a disservice overall in the way that he treats public schools. Now, having said that, lockdowns on public schools like that, schools should have been the priority and focus, and that they were more of an afterthought in the way that all of these policies rolled out. So that's my take or analysis on that particular comic.
Okay, there's a lot more of these, There's a lot more of these.
I mean, we can do this all day, but like that was a product of its time, and I don't know that I disagree. I think that the impact of lockdowns, as we unpack it, and even at the time, it didn't make sense, right? It didn't make sense that you can go into some places, you can't go into others, that you need to wear a mask to go into the restaurant, but then you can take it off when you sit down, but you have to show your little passport in order to do that. None of that made sense. And I think that, I don't know if there's a government anywhere whose approach I would wholeheartedly endorse, but I find it a lot easier to criticize Ford just because he's absurd in his approach. So.
Well, I mean, compared to Trudeau, though, where he basically called all unvaccinated people anti-science and they're all racist, they're all whatever he said, that clip where he's speaking in French, I would say and in that clip, that clip obviously gained a lot of traction, and people sort of latched onto parts of that, even adopting it as a symbol of pride, right? We are the fringe minority. And the original interview was in French. He, in his framing, was, in fairness to him, and I'm not a Trudeau fan, but I want to be fair, he was talking about a subset of people, not kind of writ large. However, I think that it contributed immensely to division and polarization in the country. And the subsequent doubling down on that sentiment made it worse. Yeah, and I would argue, just to push back on what you just said, it's easy to make fun of Doug Ford. I think it's easy to make fun of Doug Ford because he is more of a conservative. The media loves to hit rip on the conservatives. I think that's a real pattern that exists. Whereas someone who is dehumanizing a specific group of unvaccinated people, I feel like that's much more alarming and disturbing. And it really did reach a boiling point leading up to the convoy that I think, especially, left-leaning people, it was just total hypocrisy. It was total insanity. It's we have to stick up for the minority, even if they're a minority, no matter what. Oh, unvaccinated people, ban them from society. I don't care if they die. That's how insane it was right before the convoy happened to push against that. But yeah, and here's another one, because again, it's related. this is the Andrea Horwath basically said, I want to clarify my poorly received comments about mandatory vaccines. Today is opposite day. So eventually she flip-flopped. This is the joke about how she flip-flopped at the time. But it's not so much about that whole situation, because a lot of what you say here is kind of like, it's kind of lukewarm. It's not necessary. You're kind of just documenting what happened and how she flip-flopped. And this is like my bias coming out hardcore. Then you share a thread from Nora Loretto, and you say this is mandatory reading. This thread by Nora Loretto should be mandatory reading for anyone who has an opinion on, quote, vaccine passports. And this thread is very much, if we're going to think about vaccine passports, then are we going to be able to actually vaccinate everybody? Like that's pretty well the framing. If you want to talk about vaccine passports, it needs to, are we sure we can actually vaccinate everybody? So I would argue that's very, very one-sided. It's not giving any sort of credence to the people who don't want to get vaccinated.
I don't fully remember this thread, but that's the angle that she was talking about, right? So any issue, there's multiple angles. And she's saying it's not our passports positive or negative, but underlying that, is there an issue of like equality of distribution, etc., right? She doesn't probably broach on the idea of what if people don't want to be vaccinated. I imagine she doesn't, since you're reacting to this thread. But the way of approaching the question, I think, is valid, because it's not a complete story, but it is a consideration in that issue. I don't know. Like you look at any issue and there's dozens and dozens, like infinite actually, like underlying considerations and factors. And some will be more important than others, some less important than others. And sometimes what's not said at all is equally important. Now, to be fair, having had my own sort of experiences with people, vaccine passports, all of that, I don't understand why it wasn't a decision at the outset to say, in your immunization records, there is a new thing added, as opposed to show the teenager at Burger King your phone so that they know you're allowed to have a burger, right? Like that didn't make sense.
Right.
And, again, it's working on what was said and known at the time. So that's like the point of that comic was obviously the flip-flop.
Yes, of course. I'm hoping to get an apology out of you at some point. So we're gonna keep doing this. The next one is from August 18th, 2021. And this is a very typical thing you'll see in political comics, I'd say. But it's the Conservative Party war room. And it's this whole implication of conservatives are actually white supremacists. It's a very sort of, okay, yeah, we're all racists. It's a very sort of, I would argue, stale, kind of cheap talking point that if you're right wing, you're just a racist person. You have like the 14 words, which is like a white supremacist dog whistle, like we must secure an existence for the future of white children. But it's actually just secure our future. So it's like making a joke about secure our future, which was the catchphrase, I guess, of the conservatives at the time. But do you not see how you're kind of participating in the same sort of like smears a little bit, or kind of like mischaracterizations that happened to conservatives, especially or people who oppose lockdown?
Secure the future was a pretty tone deaf motto. I'm sorry.
But are you going to stand by and say, yeah, I think most conservatives are probably white supremacists? Because that's kind of the message.
That's not
you
what
sent.
that says, though. That's not what that says.
That's not what it says verbatim, but that's the implication.
No, that's your interpretation of it. Secure the future.
Well, how do you think?
That's a terrible motto. That's a terrible motto. Terrible.
How do you think left-wing people are going to interpret this? They're going to be like, yeah, all conservatives are racist. You're right, Caryma. High five. Let's go, read the Communist Manifesto together. I don't know.
I stand by that comic 100%. Look at the cookies. Did you see the cookies in the corner there?
She's deflecting now.
Pull
Now
it
she's
back up,
deflecting.
pull it back
Now
up.
she's deflecting.
Look
She's
at
trying to make
that.
some
There's
detail.
Kai Kai's cookies. KKK
Okay.
cookies. Listen, I can't help it that there's so many low-hanging fruit in the ways that this is a hilarious comic. No. I stand by this one 100%.
So you think that it's funny because
Listen,
Secure the Future is clearly a nod to the 14 words, and that's why it's funny?
It's a tone deaf and like poorly thought of, in my view. Even if we're looking at this from a purely PR perspective, that is the obvious draw and insinuation. So it's either provocative for the sake of being provocative or stupid. And either way, that's fair game for a comic, in my view.
This doesn't land at all for me because I was calling Aaron O'Toole a fat lesbian at the time. I just he's such a weak conservative. So it's just to be provocative and to exaggerate to the absurdity. I wish he was referring to the 14 words. There's no way he was doing that. Aaron O'Toole, are you kidding me?
Yeah, but he also didn't make I doubt he is responsible for the slogan, right? There's different elements within a party who are doing the marketing, who are doing the actual policy work, who are the face of it. And Aaron O'Toole, there was a disconnect. Obviously, he got turfed from his own party during the convoy. So,
yeah, but the new party still doesn't oppose anything to do with mass migration at all. But so we're going to have to agree to disagree here. I think this is kind of run of the mill. Hey, all conservatives are racist type of, because the thing is, being called a racist, Caryma, that's not like an innocent thing. That's a very sort of because it was racist, Nazi, Hitler. It goes straight to you are a bad person.
I know, I get called
right?
a racist all the time.
Right. So do you not feel bad looking back at some of this stuff and be like, maybe I was a little bit part of the problem, maybe?
Right.
No.
Listen, I'm sorry that I can't be more apologetic. So that's the apology that you're going to get right now.
Okay, fair enough. So we're gonna get into the Million Person March, or the Million March for Children. Did you go down to any of them? I know you were posting.
Yeah,
some videos.
I was in Whitby and then Pickering.
Nice. What was your interpretation of it? Because I was telling people beforehand, this protest is a little bit of a wild card, because we've seen the kind of Billboard Chris Josh Alexander thing happen. And that had its certain following, and people took note of, there was a lot of Muslim people, like Muslim parents there with their kids at this protest. And actually an individual I interviewed, Camille, he actually sort of became a leader of the Million March for Children. So this one, definitely in Toronto anyway, there was a lot of Muslim people out there. So I felt like this had a little bit of new protest in Canada. What was your kind of interpretation? What did you see?
Yeah. So what I actually saw in Whitby and Pickering, in Whitby, there was a counter protest as well as a protest. They were fairly similar in size, I would say. And everyone was on the same side of the street pretty much, just sharing the sidewalk essentially in front of a high school. And there was not nothing particularly concerning or noteworthy in the ways that people were interacting. It was fairly run of the mill. There were some speakers out of a truck, and it was more or less peaceful, apart from sort of the inherent act of being outside of a school, which I don't like any protests outside of schools, to be honest. And that goes for the counter protesters as well. I understand that their response would be, well, we're just showing up where the other guys are. But I think it's too volatile to be around schools. That's my opinion. But in any event, from there was a convoy to Pickering City Hall. Again, there were some more speeches. Some religious leaders spoke. And there was a march that was supposed to go to an overpass over the Highway 401. And ultimately that didn't happen. There was a standoff with police who prevented road access or sidewalk access to the overpass. And there were sort of negotiations that didn't really go anywhere. And then everyone kind of went home, but not before stopping along the side of the highway to hold up signs. So it was, it was not, there was nothing explosive, which actually is why I went to Durham region. I wanted to get kind of a look at it in sort of a more, I'm not sure what word I'm looking for, but a less intense kind of, there weren't clashes between the groups, right? And there were no counter protesters for the march in Pickering, and maybe a dozen or so in the park there. But my impression or understanding of the event is that it did in fact originate with a few Muslim community leaders, some with ties to convoy-related stuff, others who have emerged specifically around this issue. And the idea was quarterbacked or hijacked, however you choose to look at it, by sort of secular parent groups. But there was still a very heavy Muslim presence. That was for sure the case in Durham. And there were also a fair number of people who identified as Christians. And, sort of cohesion between those groups around this issue. I think that a lot of the media framing kind of lapped up the Canadian Anti-Hate Network's narrative of this being hate-fueled and anti-LGBTQ. And that narrative was supported by some of the protesters and the ways they behaved in cities across Canada. And that's going to be the primary focus. But the people who I spoke with, it was a range of views that were expressed. Some who I believe are regular convoy protesters who have just simply shifted to this subject because protest has become a form of community building and a pastime, and they're prepared to run with whatever. There were parents, like actual parents, who were concerned about various facets of curriculum and school policies. And there were a handful of people whose views are quite regressive and broader than sort of the stated objective of curriculum and policy. But I would say primarily it was parents who aren't prepared to cede control of their children to ideologies to which they don't ascribe.
Yeah. And there's such a, consistent pattern here. And I like to relate it to the convoy, because the convoy, I was there, I interviewed lots of people. They wanted to stop mandates. If there's any one thing that united all those people, I would argue it was stopping mandates. And then it got characterized by the media as, no, they want to overthrow the government. They have guns, all this stuff. They're violent. They're burning down apartment buildings, all of which were lies. But it was this very dishonest characterization of why people were generally there. And we're seeing the exact same thing here, where it's, I'll get Justin Trudeau to say it. It's like, yes, this was all about transphobia and homophobia. It was just about hating gay people, right? Like, that's what they're trying to say, that all of a sudden, all these parents decided that they hate gay people, and that's why they showed up, which, again, a very a strong mischaracterization of why parents were there. They're concerned about what's being taught to their kids. And I think they have every right to do that. And you brought it up, but I'll emphasize it again. The media was going off the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Says it right here. CP24, Canadian Anti-Hate Network, says marches are anti-LGBTQ2S+. The hate experts said so. So I guess all these people are, it's just about hating gay people and not actually telling the truth about why they're actually there. How are we going to solve this? Because this is the same kind of pattern we've seen, Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Did they target you specifically, actually, when they were when you were being vilified for the Chris Sky stuff?
The Canadian Anti-Hate Network wrote an article about me that has subsequently been used by a variety of named and anonymous accounts as proof of
you being a bad person.
Yeah, right? Like evil, I guess.
Right.
In fact, there's one account that was dedicated specifically to me that posted about me every single day. Anything that I post, like, they would take or misconstrue and try to portray in the worst possible light, do smears by association, etc. And that account, one day during the convoy, reposted the article 17 separate times. So
they're unemployed. So, yeah.
Are they, though? I don't know. Are they unemployed? I don't know.
Good point.
So it was a cudgel. And from then, the Anti-Hate Network has, I think, only mentioned me by name maybe once, and then by reference maybe a couple of times. But the real heavy lifting is done by, again, both anonymous and named accounts who happen to be parroting the exact same stuff. So
Here's that article. I love how they put interview in quotes here. Plan to interview racist anti-lockdown.
What else was I going to do? What else was I going to do?
Well, their whole argument is you're platforming this person, right? Like how dare you give them a like you can't even let this person speak.
That's a nonsense concept. Nonsense.
Yeah, but
So to your question, how do we get past this? It's, first of all, by recognizing that civilian versus civilian and spy versus spy is not conducive to results that improve our democracy. And it puts us in a very, very dark place where neighbors turn against neighbors. So we should avoid that at all costs. And the way to avoid that is by focusing on our institutions and making sure that they are as sound as possible, that there are checks and balances, that we minimize interference between them, and that they are holding each other to account, right? Which, is a lofty goal and ambition. A tangible thing that people listening to this right now can do is write to your member of parliament and tell them that the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is seeking $5 million in funding, should not receive that money to be a watchdog. They are eminently unqualified for that. They've proven that to be the case, in my view. And again, it's not conducive to healthy democracy. So that's a tangible thing that people can do. But, more generally, I think we kind of need to take a step back from constantly upping the ante. And what I mean by that is it's very easy and tempting to dehumanize one another, to sort of assume the worst of one another, to take cheap shots, all of that. And, I admit that I am guilty of those, like, falling prey to those instincts sometimes as well.
There it is.
For sure. But
okay,
I think
that's all I wanted to hear. That's all.
So are all of us. But I can only be accountable for myself, and that's something that I avoid doing and I work on doing, because at the end of the day, we all need to coexist, and we can't get to that place if we're constantly at each other's throats. So it starts with our own rhetoric. It starts with the ways that we engage with strangers online, being mindful that a lot of the accounts you interact with online may not be real people, right? And, so dedicate your energy accordingly, and kind of focus on real people, right? The people in your personal circles and spaces, and kind of checking in with one another, right? It sounds maybe a bit hippy dippy, but like, how do we get out of this? It's by reconnecting where division has been sown, right? The pandemic did an incredible job of splitting up families, friendships, all sorts of relationships that just were damaged. And, is it irreparable? I don't know. But reaching out and kind of trying to connect on a human level, I think that's the answer to this.
I agree. Do you have a few more minutes? There's something else I wanted to go into, just to kind of drill into anti-hate before we go. And I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but we're able to have a conversation. We have disagreements, and I feel like when those conversations of bridging the gap or going across the aisle, it's actually quite simple. And I feel like the problem is more this guilt by association, this sort of like radioactive effect that happens from cancel culture, from from the media hype that parrots lies from Canadian Anti-Hate Network. And I'm kind of speaking in generalities, but I think you know what I mean. This kind of phenomena that happens, it really does, like the hate experts, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network really does act as this moral authority to justify, smearing the reputations of people. And so I hear what you're saying, and I agree. However, I feel like the nucleus or the core of this problem are the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and the fact that there is a funded or formerly funded Canadian entity who can almost, this might be an aggressive way to put it, but almost lie with impunity. Like they can get away with just like smearing and twisting things around. And that infrastructure still exists here in Canada because the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is still there. It's still getting quoted by Global News. And as long as that's the case, Houston, we have a problem, right?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, I do. So again, that's why I mentioned the tangible action of letting, not just your member of parliament, all of your representatives know that you're not comfortable with taxpayer dollars going to an organization whose stated mandate is to effectively do call outs on relatively insignificant people, because that's the track record. Share Hategate with your elected officials. This is a national security issue, right? It's a national security issue. If the Five Eyes partners think that we are like a Monty Python skit, or if our intelligence agencies, and I use the word so generously, can't discern between a joke and a real threat. And to be clear, sometimes real threats come camouflaged as jokes, but we should be able to parse that out quickly, or at least accurately. And, you asked, is there kind of, you feel that you've lost some faith in institutions, I think, was one of your takeaways from this. And that's fair. But, silver linings to this, first of all, there were RCMP officers who called it out as it was happening, saying, hang on, we only have one source. Regardless of what the media is saying, perhaps we should exercise caution. And that ultimately, Jeremy Mackenzie was never charged with sedition or terrorism or kind of any of these high-level charges that could have ensued if a frenzy really took place and they wanted to proceed in that way, right? So that's, at least we know that there are some levels of checks and balances, knock wood, assuming that no one's at his door right now. And kind of a third silver lining is the freedom of information process. It worked. It gave us information that will help us with informed decision making. Everyone is free to do, it's very cheap to do these freedom of information requests. You're entitled to information from the government about decision-making processes, but be open-minded, don't be tunnel visioned, like we saw with the RCMP. You have to be prepared to sort of take things that don't fit into your worldview. But those are like there's some positive takeaways from this. But to the point about anti-hate continuing to operate in this way, of course it will if we don't make enough noise. So make noise.
Yeah.
But be respectful in the way that you do it, right? Be reasonable, stay grounded in facts. No one's going to hear you if you are, and I see this a lot and it irritates me on the HateGate hashtag, if you are being blatantly or subtly anti-Semitic in the way that you're expressing your concerns, no one's going to hear you. No one's going to hear you, right? If you are misstating facts, no one's going to hear you. You're going to be dismissed and you're going to drag everyone else down with you. So if you're not capable of being nuanced or like that's not your jam, that's okay. Shut up. Shut up and let other people run with the ball, because this isn't about any of those things. This is about how we want our it's about truth, absolutely, and it's about how we interact with our institutions and whether we agree that an organization that's not accountable to anyone or anything should have this level of power. I personally don't think so. So if you agree with that, then be smart and strategic in how you raise those concerns. Write to your representatives, do it by email so you have records, be persistent about it, but don't do it in all caps while you're swearing.
There's definitely a good way to get the message out and a way that isn't as effective. I certainly agree with that. Although one point, it can be kind of frustrating because it does feel as though, hey, make sure you check the facts. Make sure you don't oversimplify things. Make sure you tell the truth. Make sure there is nuance. And it's, I think of a quote from Justin Trudeau, like there will be consequences. The unvaccinated pose a risk. Like there's no nuance there, Like,
I know, but do you want to be in a race to the bottom, or are you going to elevate?
I just think it's frustrating because that hasn't stopped. That hasn't stopped.
Of course, it's frustrating.
Justin Trudeau
it's frustrating if your adversaries aren't playing fair or playing by the rules. Does that mean you also discard the rules and just like fuck the game and we're just gonna all descend into anarchy?
I'm not going to get hung up on nuance and details when there's such an epic intelligence failure happening in the country. Like I'm not going to. That's kind of my own personal approach to communicating this. Like, well, technically, there's still some okay RCMP officers. That's a fair point, and you're absolutely right. The fact that Jeremy McKenzie is hopefully going to beat all of his charges, there still is a system that works. Thank God, but.
There's a lot to be angry about as well. And I get that. And people can express their anger and should express their anger. But, try to do it in a way where you're going to be heard is my gentle suggestion.
Right.
And yeah.
Thank you so much, Caryma. We're going to wrap it up in a second. But first, a quick gotcha question. So get ready. You were just saying how disappointing it is to see an organization like the Canadian Anti-Hate Network receiving funding from the government and being so inefficient or kind of spreading lies, as it were, misinformation. During the pandemic, there was a fund to pay online influencers to promote COVID-19 vaccines. Did you receive any of this funding, Caryma?
No?
No? Okay.
I would have applied, but no.
Okay. Just had to be sure. Any last things that you want to say in regards to HateGate? We covered a lot of ground, or 1 million march for children, or to promote anything else that you got going on.
No, just keep using the HateGate hashtag. We trended for over a week straight. Yesterday, there were a few other things going on around the country, so understandable. But keep using that hashtag. And sorry, throw that hashtag in when you're talking about the million march as well. Absolutely.
Just throw it in there. Throw it. It's only 9 characters, guys. Yeah.
And 9 characters, well worth it, because there's a lot to unpack, and there's still threads that I hope to unravel. It's an evolving story, and I'm not going to go quietly into that good night. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Caryma Sa'd, for being on the show. I'm glad we were able to be civil for the most part. And I'm thanks again so much for writing Hate Gate and doing the actual work of organizing everything and laying it all out for people. Because I really feel this is going to be the beginning of, calling out this whole ecosystem of essentially mischaracterizing Canadians and really fomenting hatred. They're the ones fomenting hatred, I would argue. But
and you can't fight hate with hate. So keep that in mind, folks, when you are reacting to this. I know it's a big ask, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Raise your vibration, raise your chakras to the love vibration. And as we always say, it is okay to demand higher standards. Thanks for watching, guys.